And now for tonight, I want to introduce our guest author, Charles Knight. He is a native of Richmond, so kind of welcome back in a sense, where he developed a love of history at a very early age. Charles Knight has worked at museums and historic sites for more than 20 years and has given historical presentations to audiences all across the country. He is the author of Valley Thunder, the Battle of Newmarket, and the opening of the Shenandoah Valley Campaign, May 1864, which was published in 2010. And tonight he's here to talk about his newest book, From Arlington to Appomattox, Robert E. Lee's Civil War Day by Day, 1861 to 1865. And so with that, I'm going to turn the screen over to our guest author.
Great. Thank you, Kelly. And let's see here. There we go. All right, and good evening, everybody. And it's my pleasure to be here with y'all. And like Kelly said, tonight I'm going to be talking to you a little bit about my newest book, From Arlington to Appomattox, which is kind of an almanac or reference book, if you will, about about Lee during the Civil War. And I'm going to make my Brady box thing or Brady Bunch thing over here go away so I can actually see my slides. There we go. Okay. I think the best way to talk about what this book is really to talk about what it's not. It's not your basic Lee biography. I'm sure many of you are familiar with E.B. Long's book, The Civil War Day by Day. This is kind of like the same thing, only done from a Lee point of view. So as much as I possibly could, I recreate every day from mid-April 1861 through mid-April of 1865 of Lee's life, talking about where he was, who he was writing to, what he was doing. There's a few instances where we even was even able to find out what he was eating. So there's all kinds of minutia in here. So if you're into Lee or you want to know more about the Lee family or what it was like to run an army during the Civil War, I think you'll find lots of stuff to be interested in From Arlington to Appomattox. And with that, I will jump right in here and oops, if I do that first. I'm going to kind of split tonight's presentation into two things. I want to talk first a little bit about the Lee historiography, how we know what we know about Lee. And then for the second part, I'm going to jump in and highlight some of my favorite things, some of the lesser known anecdotes about Lee. Some of the things might be familiar to you. Some of them probably are not. But I'm start off here talking about the many books that have been written about Lee. Probably first and foremost in everybody's mind when it comes to Lee biographies is this one. Douglas Freeman, of course, from Richmond, longtime newspaper man turned historian. He probably knew more about Robert E. Lee than maybe even Lee's children did. Freeman spent decades researching, researching Lee's life, and he produced the 4-volume Lee biography, which is still probably the best biography that's out there on him. It's not exactly what you would call balanced, but Freeman definitely had a bit of a hero complex there when it came to Lee. But he uncovered all sorts of stuff. He literally spent decades researching Lee's life. In addition to this biography, he edited a collection of Lee papers. He did, of course, the 3-volume Lee's Lieutenants, as well as several other volumes and projects about Lee. So really, nobody in at least the early part of the 20th century knew more about Robert E. Lee probably than Douglas Freeman. And of course, when he was finished with his Lee project, he jumped head first into George Washington, and his work on Washington really kind of dwarfs his Lee work in some respects. But anyway, much of what we know about Lee, or at least the popular image of Lee today, really comes from Freeman's portrayal of Lee. When you think about Lee, you're really, in a lot of cases, the images and occurrences that come to mind are not necessarily true to history. What you're getting really is Freeman's version of Lee. And that stood for decades. It wasn't until probably the 1960s is when you have people that are really starting to bring Lee back down to earth, to rehumanize Lee, if you will. And Thomas Connolly probably did more to pull Lee down off the pedestal that Freeman built for him than anybody else. And of course, excuse me, out of the dozens of Lee biographies that are out there today, there are other good ones that give a more balanced view of Lee. Elizabeth Pryor's book, Emory Thomas's book, and quite a few others. So there's definitely no shortage of material to turn to when it comes to learning about Robert E. Lee. As I'm sure many of you know, Lee never wrote his memoirs. After the war, within just a few months of Appomattox, he shifted careers and became the president of what is now Washington and Lee University. But while he was there, he kept looking back on the previous 4 years of his life and wanted to make sure that that the events and that time period were remembered. And he was considering writing a history of at least his own campaigns or the history of the Army in Northern Virginia in his later years, but he never got around to doing it. He started collecting materials, but he never really got very far. Excuse me, I'm getting over a cold. You'll have to excuse me. He wrote to one of his cousins a few months before his death that a history of the events of the period, talking about the war, would be desirable. And I've had it in view to write one of the campaigns in Virginia in which I was particularly engaged. I've already collected some materials for the work, but I lack so much that I wish to obtain. I have not commenced the narrative. And of course, he died before he really got off the ground with that project. And in a lot of quarters, it was really considered a great loss that Lee did not put anything to paper. Here's a sample quote from John Gordon, who of course did give us a great memoir. A lot of it is made up and embellished and existed only in Gordon's mind, but Gordon was a tremendous writer. And unfortunately, Lee was not the writer that Gordon or Chamberlain or Grant or Porter Alexander were. Lee, if you read his writings, he wrote an introduction to his father's Revolutionary War memoirs after the war, and that is some of the driest stuff you will ever read. It will put you directly to sleep. So Lee just, out of all of his gifts, all of his talents, writing was not one of them. So I will respectfully disagree here with General Gordon that it's probably better for Lee and his image in history that he did not write his memoirs, because we would probably think less of him just because of his lack of skills as a writer. That's not to say that he was not a good writer overall. When it comes to just narrative history, that was not his thing. He had a very distinct writing style. He had a very good sense of humor that's evident when he's writing to family and friends. But just when he's writing for the general public, it was something that he just did not have. Now, while Lee did not give us a history of his life or his time during the Civil War, many of his inner circle did. And this is where I draw a lot of my material that I got in my book from, is his inner circle. Nobody spent more time with Lee during the war than his personal staff. And I'll talk quite a bit about them. And we'll start off with this guy right here, Charles Marshall. He served with Lee for about 3 years. Marshall was a lawyer from Baltimore. And if you've not heard of Marshall, I guarantee you are familiar with his work. Lee's farewell order at Appomattox was written by Charles Marshall. All of Lee's campaign reports that you'll find in the official records were written by Charles Marshall. All of his legal correspondence that dealt with that dealt with Richmond, in particular, the Conscription Act of 1862, Charles Marshall's work yet again. And shortly after General Lee died, his eldest son, Custis, asked Marshall if he would write an article that the college was going to publish about Lee. They were working on a memorial volume about the general. And Custis asked Marshall if he would do it. And Marshall declined. He didn't think he had the ability to do it, and especially in the short window of time that Custis needed it. But that idea struck a chord with Marshall, and he realized that he and the others of Lee's staff did have access to the man that nobody else had. And Marshall and many of the others decided to set about writing about their time with Lee. Now, Marshall got farther than Lee, but in the end, it met with the same result. Marshall died before he finished his memoirs. But I'll quote a piece of a letter here that Marshall wrote to Cassius Lee, the same cousin that earlier Lee quote was from. The author should have access to the most authentic proof of all that he may state. He should have ample time to collect all facts, and he should omit nothing that bears upon the subject. I had not then, nor have I now, the means of writing the more extensive work, though I am using every means to prepare myself at some future time to do so. I'm preparing a life of the general, talking about Lee, which I hope to present within a year or 18 months, provided I can get the materials. If I can do no more, I shall collect all that I can and write all I know to be used by some future biographer. And that is actually what Marshall succeeded in doing. He collected all sorts of stuff. He started writing his memoirs. There are about 3 sizable chunks of it. They're not all connected. They're kind of disjointed pieces of the war, the way he was writing it. But after Marshall died, his daughter found these. And it was right about the time that a British general, Frederick Maurice, published a biography of Lee. This would be right about 1920. And Marshall's daughter contacted this British General Maurice and said, and explained to him who she was. Charles Marshall was my father, and I found his papers and his incomplete memoirs. Would you be interested in these? Now, after Maurice, I'm sure, got over his initial shock and anger, every historian, it never fails. After your book is published, that's when people come to you with these sources that you want. So I'm sure he had the reaction that most of us would, why didn't you give this to me 2 years ago? But eventually he did collect it, and he edited it and put it out, and it was published in a volume called Lee's Aid to Camp. It's still available today, and it's Marshall's history of the war. Again, there are some sizable gaps in there because Marshall never completed it, but Marshall gives great insight into what it was like at headquarters and about working with Lee. But nobody had closer contact with Lee during the war than this young man, Walter Taylor. Taylor is with Lee for almost the entire war. He joins Lee the first week of May, 1862. So there's only about 3 weeks or so of the war that Taylor is not attached to Lee in some way, shape, or form. Taylor would write several books, and most of his letters from that time period survive. And Taylor is a great source of information. His 2 books, now they were written for public consumption, so they're somewhat filtered. He was not going to say anything bad about his former chief, neither did Marshall. When they're writing for public eye, they are very respectful toward Lee. When they're writing for private reasons, when they're writing to family or friends, that's when you get their true picture of Lee. Taylor did not like Lee, despite his post-war reverence for him. They really did not get along all that well. There was a huge age gap between them. Taylor was about the age of Lee's sons, so it's kind of a father-son relationship there in terms of age. But it's reading Taylor and some of these other guys' private letters that you learn these things about Lee that you wouldn't necessarily get from Freeman and some of the other biographies. Lee had a horrible temper. His health was a lot worse than is really known today. And in fact, Taylor referred to him as the tycoon. When Lee got off on a mean streak, so to speak, he stuck with it for quite a while. And he was just very unpleasant to be around quite a bit when he was in one of his moods. But of course, you get that with anybody. The people that you're around the most, they're the ones that see the true you. And that's what Lee's staff really witnessed for Lee. But this is what Taylor had to say in the introduction to one of his books, describing their relationship, about how it was very respectful. There wasn't really the distinction that you would expect between the commanding general and these junior officers, these young men on its staff. Refers to the camaraderie that they shared. And unlike a lot of the federal generals who had large staffs, you think of McClellan, he's got this French prince on his staff. Lee didn't have that. It was his personal staff was anywhere from 3 to 5 guys throughout the entire war. And none of them worked harder than Taylor. If you've seen the movie Gettysburg, there's a scene in there, I think it's the evening of July 1st, where the actor portraying Taylor is talking to Lee. And they're talking about the workload. And Taylor says, oh, I'd be offended if you got more staff. I can handle the work. That was not really Taylor's attitude. He complained bitterly about the workload, about how he was pulling more than his share on the rest of the staff. And it wasn't until about late January, early February 1865, when the others had a taste of what Taylor had to go through when the workload evened out. But anyway, enough about that. Move on. Talk a little bit more detail about Taylor's writings. Taylor, he was from Norfolk, Virginia. He was a banker. He was a VMI graduate. He was actually the auditor for the Norfolk and Petersburg Railroad, Billy Mahone's railroad, immediately before the war. Both of his brothers also worked for the Norfolk and Petersburg. They served on Mahone's staff during the war. But when Lee goes off to West Virginia, Taylor's with him. When Lee goes to the South Atlantic coast, Taylor's with him. Taylor is, of course, with him throughout all the campaigns of the Army in Northern Virginia. Again, he's there for all but 3 weeks. And the people at large, especially after the war is over and you get the formation of the UCV and these people who are hungry to know more about their former chief, they're looking to Walter Taylor. They want to know, they're jealous of him. Basically, you had access to this man that the rest of us could only dream about. Please tell us what it was like. So Taylor was often requested, as were Marshall and some of the other staff, to come speak at UCV meetings and reunions and whatnot. Taylor was a very popular speaker whenever there was a reunion held in Norfolk. It was usually a reunion of Mahone's brigade, but Taylor was a very popular speaker because of the insight that he could offer about Lee. And so when his first book comes out in 1877 called 4 Years with Lee, people were looking forward to this thing. They couldn't wait to read it. And then they open it. And it's nothing but a really by the numbers history of the Army of Northern Virginia. The title was very misleading. It's not about Taylor's 4 years with Lee. It's a history of the Army in Northern Virginia and the numbers that it had in each campaign. Taylor, as a banker, he was a numbers guy. When the morning reports and casualty reports and whatnot were turned into headquarters, Taylor was the one who processed them. So nobody knew the strength of the Army in Northern Virginia at various battles and campaigns better than Taylor. So that's what he put to paper. And as more and more public disappointment became evident, people were reaching out to him. And finally, by the turn of the century, he gave in and he wrote another book that was the one he should have written in the first place. It's the more personal look at his 4 years beside Lee. And that one is called General Lee, His Campaigns in Virginia, 1906. And the title should really be switched because the content really is not reflective of the titles of those two books. If you want to read one of Taylor's books, I would go for the later one, the General Lee, His Campaigns book, the 1906 book. But really, Taylor's great contribution to Civil War scholarship was unintentional. His letters primarily to his future wife, Betty Saunders, were a goldmine of information. Most of them survived from about mid-1862 through to the end of the war. They survive in the Norfolk Public Library. And that's where Taylor is open and honest about Lee and the inner workings of headquarters. That's where you find out when Taylor and Lee butt heads. That's when you find out where Lee is in a bad mood. That's where you find out where other staff officers and other generals are being critical and kind of second guessing Lee. And those papers were published in 1995 under the title Lee's Adjutant. It leaves out the post-war papers, and that's where some of the really good stuff is when Taylor is writing to the other members of Lee's staff, as well as Jackson's staff and Longstreet's staff. So there's some good stuff that's not included in that as well, the post-war stuff. But unfortunately, Betty Saunders destroyed his letters from 1861 and the first half of 1862. And when Taylor found out about that, he was livid because he explained to her, please don't destroy my letters. I'm saving these because these are not just meant for your information. This is my memories of the war. Please don't destroy them. So after she got the letter that said, please don't destroy them, she stopped destroying them. But because his letters from 1861 and the first half of 62 do not survive, there's really scant information on Lee in West Virginia and on the South Atlantic coast. And those are the two times that we really know the least about Lee. And it's primarily because Taylor's letters do not survive from that time period. And when you read his books, you can see that he was using those letters as an outline to follow. And the 61 and early 62 parts are the weakest part of his books, because again, he was having to rely solely on memory. He didn't have his letters in front of him to refresh things in his mind. But Taylor was not the only one to write about their former commander. Armistead Long, who was Lee's military secretary beginning in late 61 and on up through about mid 63. He wrote a huge book called The Memoirs of Robert E. Lee. It came out in mid 1880s. And not only is that a great source, it's amazing that he was able to do it. Long went blind in the process of writing this. So the fact that he was actually able to get it finished is just fascinating to me. And when you look at the manuscript that is housed at UNC, it truly just looks like chicken scratch, because by the end he was completely blind and obviously could not see what he was writing, but he did have somebody that could decipher what he was putting down. Fitzhugh Lee, the general's nephew, he wrote a biography of Lee that came out in the mid 1890s that was really more to boost Fitz's political career than it was to bring anything new about the general to the forefront. Fitz was not a great commander. He really owed his rise to the fact that his last name was Lee, and he built his political career off of the fact that his last name was Lee. But he offered a few insights into his uncle, but not a lot. You would expect more from him. Lee's youngest son, Rob, served briefly in the Rock Ridge Artillery and then was an aide to his older brother, Rooney. He published a memoir of sorts right around the turn of the century, and he also included some edited, at least, versions of Lee's letters. Again, they were edited for public eyes, so a lot of the personal and private stuff was cut out, but Lee Jr. offers a lot of good information on his father. Mentioned Marshall already, and how his incomplete memoirs were published in the 20s by Frederick Maurice. Thomas Talcott, who was the son of Lee's mentor, Andrew Talcott. The younger Talcott here would serve on Lee's staff for the first half of the war before he went on to command an engineer regiment. He wrote a couple of articles for public consumption. Charles Venable, I'll talk more about him in just a minute, but he is a fascinating individual. He was a brilliant mathematician. He was a college professor. He strikes me as just being one of these guys who was too smart for his own good, and he spoke his mind. He did not have a filter. He's kind of I guess, almost the Civil War version of Sheldon Cooper. Brilliant, and is not doesn't really understand the concept of not speaking his tongue. Venable would serve with Lee from June of 62 on through the end of the war, and Venable butted heads with Lee more so than anybody else. They were closer in age, and again, Venable was not afraid to speak his mind. If something was on his mind, it was immediately going to come out of his mouth, and that oftentimes did not sit well with Lee. Some of his letters to his wife survive. He wrote his memoirs, and his wife wrote her memoirs, but neither one of them were ever published. They're sitting in the archives at UVA, and that's what my next project is going to be, is to publish Venable's memoirs. But there is some great information that you find nowhere else. Not even any of the staff, any of the other staff officers mention some of the stuff that Venable does. And if you've read my book, I would point out to you September 17th, 1862. There's an incident in there that happened at Sharpsburg that is ascribed to Venable. If you've read it, you know what I'm talking about. If you don't, well, you'll have to get the book to find out. Giles Cook was another one who served on Lee's staff at the tail end of the war. His diary survives. I think it's at the Virginia Historical Society. I don't remember now. And he is a great source for the closing days at Petersburg and the Appomattox campaign. But they were not the only ones. Robert Chilton, who was Lee's chief of staff, some of his letters survived. They were actually at the Museum of the Confederacy archives. And some of the other staff members, there was a Francis Smith, who was the nephew of the VMI superintendent, who served on Lee's staff for a couple of weeks in, I think it was May and June of 1861. Some of his letters survive. John Washington, whom I'll talk more about in just a minute, who's kind of an overlooked and forgotten member of Lee's staff. His letters are scattered, but his wartime letters are fantastic. And this is what Lee had to say about a person's letters. And I think this is very true. It has been said that our letters are good representatives of our mind. They certainly present a good criterion for judging the character of the individual. This is what he was writing to his youngest daughter, Mildred, a few years before the war. And I think that is very true. If you want to see what somebody's actually thinking, read their personal letters. Don't read what they wanted the public to see. Read what they wanted no one else to see. And of course, Lee's letters, a good chunk of them anyway, and by no means is this all of them, were published during the centennial back in '61. A good sampling of Lee's private letters and his official correspondence with Richmond. And that's a great source right there. If you don't have it, I would suggest getting hold of that. And that will give you a good measure of Lee, both as a person and as a general. All right, now I want to jump in to some of the Lee incidents from the book. And I figure we'll start off with what was Lee doing on this date in 1861. This is one that I actually knew off the top of my head. I didn't have to look this one up, but I'll look it up anyway. July 29th, 1861. Lee is on a train going from Richmond to Stanton. He's on his way out to Western Virginia. He was going to take command in the mountains out there in Western Virginia. There was suffice to say, there were some command issues, I guess is the best way to put it, out in the mountains of what is now West Virginia. And Lee had been sent out there to oversee what was going on. So he and Taylor and John Washington and two of the Lee family slaves, Perry and Meredith, are on a train on the Virginia Central Railroad from Richmond headed out to Stanton. And he will arrive in Stanton on the evening mail train. So probably right about this time in 1861, their train is arriving in Stanton, and they will detrain and head out to find lodging for the night. And on the way, they pass by the camp of the troop artillery, where they are saluted as the general passes by. So that's what Lee was doing on this date in 1861. I tell you how many years ago that was, but I'm not a math person. I'm a history person, so I can't do that right off the top of my head. But anyway, okay. Of course, when Lee first resigns his commission with the United States Army, he goes to Richmond. He's appointed to command of Virginia's armed forces. And this is perhaps one of the most thankless tasks that he performs during the entire war. He really has to bring an army out of nothingness. The state, of course, has militia units, but they're all over the place. They're in varying degrees of order. Some of the officers are there for political reasons. Some of them have military training. Some of them don't. Some of the units are, of course, better equipped and better trained than others. And it's Lee's job to take all this chaos and form it into a respectable fighting force. So that's what he will spend the first few, well, really months of the war doing, from about mid-April all the way up until his departure at the end of July 1861. He's trying to bring order out of this chaos, organizing units, getting important points fortified and garrisoned. And then you add to it, when the Confederate government relocates from Montgomery to Richmond, then you have conflicting orders. You know, the Confederate War Department wants one thing, Lee wants another thing. So it's just a very chaotic and very thankless task that he is performing at this time. He spends most of that time behind a desk at his office in Richmond. And the number of people that must have come into his office on a daily basis, I'm sure was well into the double digits. Of course, very little of that is documented, but we know that he was being constantly besieged by office seekers, by politicians wanting commissions, by politicians who had constituents and friends that they wanted to get commissions for, as well as some of his own family members coming in trying to get commissions as well. So he was just constantly busy, probably spending anywhere from 18 to 20 hours a day at times in his office dealing with things. And during this time, he's meeting almost daily with the governor, with the governor's advisory council. And then once the Confederate government relocates, with President Davis and or the Secretary of War at that time. So he's just constantly busy with administrative stuff. But he does find time to go into the field 3 times during this first few months of the war. In mid-May, he goes down the peninsula to Norfolk to inspect the fortifications there. Then at the end of the month, he goes north to Manassas. And then about a week after that, in the first week of June, he goes down the peninsula to Jamestown Island, Yorktown, Williamsburg area to inspect the fortifications there. And on all 3 of these occasions, he does not like what he finds, and all 3 of them result in a change of command. Beauregard will take command in Northern Virginia as a result of Lee. And we'll also see changes elsewhere as well. John Magruder on the peninsula. So Lee is very hands-on during this time period, and he's very involved with getting the commanders in places that they need to go. And initially, he turns to men that either he knows personally or he knows by reputation. Who does he put in command at Lynchburg? Jubal Early. Who does he put in command at the cavalry training camp? Richard Ewell. So these are people that he served with. Of course, Beauregard, he served with him in Mexico. So people that he knows and can trust. Joe Johnston at Harper's Ferry is another example. Men that he knows and men that he can trust. Benjamin Huger, or Huger, excuse me, going down to Norfolk, wound up to be one of his not quite so good decisions, but Lee knew Huger from before the war and trusted him. And unfortunately, that one did not work out as well as some of the others. Okay, I mentioned that on this date, 1861, Lee and Taylor and this guy, John Washington, are on their way to Western Virginia. John Augustine Washington, he is the last owner of Mount Vernon. He is the great grandnephew or something like that of George Washington. I forget the exact relation, but it's something weird like that. And he wound up inheriting Mount Vernon, which was in very sad shape at the time that he owned it. So of course, he sold it in 57 or 58 to the Mount Vernon Ladies Association. So this fellow, John Washington, is indirectly responsible for the preservation of Mount Vernon. Now, he joins Lee's staff in early May of 1861, about the same time that Taylor does, within a couple of days of one another. I suspect that they at least knew of each other, both of them being from Northern Virginia and running in the same social circles. I imagine they at least knew of each other. They probably met on occasion, but they do not seem to have been very closely acquainted prior to Washington's assignment to Lee's staff. They very close French, well, not close, but a friendship developed between the two of them. Washington was probably the closest thing that Lee had to a friend at that time, despite their difference in rank. They were very close in age and, again, similar backgrounds. And Washington was, like Lee, very religious. In fact, the three of them would all share a tent in West Virginia. They messed together in that tent. It was their sleeping quarters as well as their office. And Washington would lead them in morning prayer as well as evening prayer. And Lee would say later that he got to know Washington perhaps better during their few weeks together, sharing a tent in West Virginia than he could have any other way. Now, it rains almost the whole time that Lee is in West Virginia, and he's trying to organize an attack against the Union forces out there. They want to drive McClellan and Rosecrans back out of Western Virginia, push them back to Ohio, and reclaim that area, even though it's not at all pro-secession out there in the mountains. They still want to reclaim it since it is Virginia territory. And this is Lee's first offensive, and it goes horribly. It's kind of like the 7 Days campaign, or the initial plan, if you will, at Mechanicsville and Beaver Dam Creek, but on a smaller scale. Lee was learning on the fly. He's learning on the job here. And his plan was just too complicated. The various commands could not see each other. One was at the top of a mountain, one's at the bottom of a mountain. They're out of visual contact, and they're relatively green troops. So his plan was just too complicated, and it fizzles into nothingness. He had everybody in position, but the attack never comes off. So in disgust, Lee was trying to organize or figure out a way to salvage something out of this campaign. So he sends Washington and his son Rooney out to reconnoiter the Union position and try and figure out a way to get at them. Well, Washington and Rooney, they have 2 or 3 of Rooney's cavalrymen with them. They're ambushed. The Federals saw them coming up this riverbed, up well, it's kind of a creek bed at that point, but they saw him coming up this ravine in the mountains, and they set up an ambush for him. And this entire company opens fire on these 4 or 5 guys. Washington is killed. He's absolutely riddled with bullets. Rooney's horse is killed out from under him. He barely gets away. He uses Washington's horse to escape, and Washington is killed. And I think this is the day, September 13th, 1861. This is the day that the war really first hit home for Lee. Of course, you know, he'd been at war for several months now. He lost his home. Well, several homes. Roman Coke is going to fall to Union forces pretty shortly, and White House at Rooney's plantation is also soon going to be occupied by the Federals. But he's been forced out of Arlington, lost most of his possessions. But I think Washington's death is when the war really hit home for Lee. And he writes several letters. He writes to Washington's daughter. He writes to their a common cousin of both Washington and Lee, a fellow by the name of Turner. And I think Edward Turner lived up in Northern Virginia. But these letters, and he also writes a letter to his wife as well. But these letters of Lee's talking about Washington's death, there's a range of emotion present in these letters that you don't see anywhere else. He goes from obvious sense of loss and despair to, in the next sentence, just out and out anger. You know, you can almost visualize the veins popping out in his neck, and he's just furious at the situation. So again, I think this is really the day that the war hit home for Lee. And this is the letter that he writes to, whoops, I did not mean to do that. This is the letter that he writes to Washington's daughter, informing her of his death. And he tells her, that your dear father, in reconnoitering the enemy's position yesterday, came within the range of the fire of the enemy pickets and was instantly killed. He fell in the cause to which he had devoted all his energies and in which his noble heart was enlisted. My intimate association with him for some months has more fully disclosed to me his great worth than double as many years of ordinary intercourse would have been sufficient to reveal. We shared the same tent, and morning and evening as his earnest devotion to Almighty God elicited my grateful admiration. And just as another example of how much Lee was affected by Washington's death, just before Rooney came back to Lee with news that Washington had been killed, a courier came in with a message from Washington. It was just an everyday little message, the result of their reconnaissance so far. And it said the road down to such and such, I think they're at Elkwater, is clear. And again, there's no great military value in this letter, but it was signed by Washington. Lee kept this little scrap of paper from Washington, turned it over on the back, and wrote the notation, "This is the last message I ever received from John A. Washington." He kept that with him for the rest of the war. And a couple of weeks after Appomattox, he sent it to Louisa Washington, Washington's daughter. And again, the outpouring of emotion in that letter, it touches you. You know, Lee was obviously very deeply affected by Washington's death. So this is one of those really, I think, overlooked episodes, but it had a profound impact on Lee. I spent too much time talking about this. Let's get Lee somewhere else besides West Virginia. He goes to the South Atlantic coast, South Carolina, Georgia, north part of Florida after his West Virginia campaign. And he's put in charge of defending that area down there. He's not wild about this idea at all. In fact, he writes to one of his daughters, tells her, "This is a forlorn hope. This is worse than West Virginia. What do they possibly expect me to do down here?" But he actually does get things organized. Here again, organization is his strong suit. He gets troops organized. He gets key points fortified. He gets the Charleston and Savannah Railroad in operation in conjunction with the military. That becomes his main line of defending the region. He does not have anywhere near enough troops to defend every point. So he comes up with this fantastic idea of keeping his troops on the railroad, shuttling them back and forth, letting the Federals have the coastline, but if they try and come inland, he's going to have a force to meet them via the railroad. And on one of his inspection tours down there, he visits his father's grave. Of course, Light Horse Harry Lee, Lee's father, was a Revolutionary War hero, a great cavalry commander during the Rev War. And he was quite the hero after the Revolutionary War, but his star fell quickly during the War of 1812. Light Horse Harry was vehemently opposed to war with Britain, which was just the wrong opinion to have at the time. And he was very nearly killed by a mob in Baltimore because of his anti-war sentiment. And he had also incurred numerous debts. His debts are the reason that the family had to give up Stratford Hall. And Lee and his father were never close. So even though Lee was stationed in Savannah near his father's grave during the 1830s, right after he graduated from West Point, never went and visited him. He never visited the grave until sometime in early 1862. Light Horse Harry had really exiled himself to the Bahamas, and as he neared the end of his life, he was on his way back, I guess, to say goodbye to his family, but he fell ill, and the boat that he was on had to put in Georgia, and they stopped at the estate that was owned by General Nathaniel Greene, another Revolutionary War commander, and Lee died there several days after arriving at Greene's estate, and he was buried in the cemetery there. And so when Lee is stationed down here in early 1862, he goes and visits his father's grave. And this is what he told his wife about it. While at Fernandina, I went over to Cumberland Island and walked up to Dungeness, the former residence of General Greene. It was my first visit to the house, and I had the gratification at length of visiting my father's grave. He died there, you may recollect, on his way from the West Indies and was interred in one corner of the family cemetery. The spot is marked by a plain marble slab with his name, age, and date of death. That's all he had to say about this visit. He didn't say when it happened. He didn't, he didn't revel in this. There was none of the emotion present that there were in any of the Washington letters. It's just, oh, I saw my father's grave. And he spends the rest of the letter really describing Greene's estate, talking about the house. So the distance between Lee and his father, is very evident in this letter. It's the relationship simply just was not there. After that, in early 62, Lee is brought back to Richmond. There were rumors that he was going to be the new Secretary of War, and Congress had actually cleared the way for that, passing legislation making it legal for an active duty Army officer to be Secretary of War. So everybody thought, hey, that's what Lee is going to be doing, but that's not what President Davis had in mind. Lee is brought to Richmond to be Davis's military advisor. Now, Davis was not one who wanted to be told what to do. Davis was a West Pointer, he's a Mexican War veteran, and considered himself a military genius. He did not need anyone else's advice or opinion on how to do things. He knew how to run the war. So Lee is in a very difficult spot here with this new assignment, but he makes the most out of it. He and Davis got along well. They had a great relationship on up until the last few months of the war when things were falling apart around them. But Lee knew how to work with Davis, which was something that Joe Johnston and Beauregard did not know how to do. So Lee makes the most of this, and he uses this position. And he's really the one calling a lot of the shots. He's the one moving the pieces on the chessboard here. Stonewall's Valley Campaign really comes about in large part because of Lee. Johnston didn't want it to happen. Lee did. So guess what? It happened. And here again, quoting a letter to Cassius Lee, I have been called here, Richmond, very unexpectedly to me, and have been placed on duty at this place under the direction of the president. I'm willing to do anything I can do to help the noble cause we are engaged in, and to take any position. But the lower and more humble the position, the more agreeable to me and the better qualified I should feel to fill it. I fear I shall be able to do little in the position assigned me, and cannot hope to satisfy the feverish and excited expectation of our good people. And that was something that Lee was constantly fighting. The public they always wanted victories, and Lee knew that you had to prepare for things. Kind of the same type of thing that Rosecrans and Meade run into. The politicians want you to advance and to win, but you can't do it until you're ready. So that's yet another thing that Lee had to fight against here. And one of the first things that he does in this new post, the Conscription Act, which was written by Charles Marshall and signed by Lee. So Lee gets the credit, but it was Marshall's writing. Lee will, of course, succeed to command of the Army of Northern Virginia when Johnston is wounded at Seven Pines. Lee's first major offensive there, the 7 Days Campaign, does not go well for him, but it goes well enough that he drives McClellan and the Army of the Potomac away from Richmond, and then he's able to turn his attention to Northern Virginia with a new force under John Pope. Now, Lee respected just about every other commander that he was ever up against. McClellan, Meade, even Burnside. Lee respected them. He knew them. And he thought that they were honest gentlemen. What's his name? Sedgwick was one of Lee's favorite officers on the other side. But then there was John Pope. Lee hated Pope. Lee had absolutely no use for John Pope. Lee did not like him personally. He did not like the way that Pope waged war. So when he sent Jackson up to Northern Virginia, he didn't tell him just go defeat Pope. He told him to suppress Pope. And he constantly referred to Pope as a miscreant. Lee had absolutely no use for John Pope. So I'm sure he took great delight in defeating Pope at Second Manassas. But Lee has a couple of close calls on the way to Second Manassas. He's very nearly captured by enemy cavalry on the way to Thoroughfare Gap. There was a detachment of enemy cavalry that appeared not far, maybe as few as 100 or 200 yards off in the distance when Lee was out in advance of Longstreet's force. Lee was the advance guard of the army. There was nothing between him and these Federals, but the Federals did not attack because they did not realize who they were looking at. And so Lee very narrowly escapes there. And then he has another close call when he arrives at Jackson's battlefield there at Groveton. And the source for this is Charles Venable, who joined Lee's staff just before the 7 Days Campaign. On reaching the field of Jackson's fight of the 28th, Lee ordered his staff to remain at the edge of the woods out of sight of the enemy while he went forward on foot to Jackson's skirmish line. And he made his own observation of the condition of things on Jackson's right. On his return to the edge of the woods, he swiftly remarked, "A sharpshooter came near killing me just now. We saw how near it was, as his cheek had been grazed by the bullet of the sharpshooter." So this is one of those things where, fraction of an inch, one way or the other, either kills him or it misses him entirely, but it managed to just catch his cheek and leave a mark on there. Venable is the only source for this. And Lee's luck runs out after the battle when he breaks one wrist and severely sprains the other when Traveler pulls him down somewhere near Bull Run. And so when the Army of Northern Virginia goes through Leesburg and into Maryland on the other side of the Potomac, Lee is not valiantly riding atop his gray Charger as one might expect. No, he is in the back of an ambulance with both of his arms in a sling. He's not able to feed himself. He's not able to dress himself. So it's a very low point for Lee there as he makes his entrance into Maryland. Of course, his army comes dangerously close to disaster there on the banks of Antietam Creek, and he will withdraw back across the Potomac into Northern Virginia. And it's while the army is there in the lower Shenandoah Valley recuperating, trying to recover from its Sharpsburg losses, that he learns of the death of one of his daughters, Annie Lee. She and her mother had been vacationing in North Carolina when Annie was very suddenly stricken with some illness, possibly a combination of illnesses, and died a very slow and painful death. And she was buried originally on the family cemetery there at the resort just outside of Arlington, North Carolina. She was moved eventually to Washington and Lee. But Lee was very touched by his daughter's death, as you might expect. And Walter Taylor provides us a glimpse at Lee's reaction. This was Taylor as he was witnessing Lee receiving the news. One morning, the mail was received, and I can't see, it's behind the little Brady Bunch box over here. The letters were distributed, as was the custom, but no one knew whether any home news had been received by the general. At the usual hour, he summoned me to his presence to know if there were any matters of any army routine upon which his judgment and action were desired. The papers containing such cases were presented to him. He reviewed and gave his orders in regard to them. I then left, but for some cause returned in a few moments, and with my accustomed freedom, entered his tent without announcement or ceremony, when I was startled and shocked to see Lee overcome with grief, an open letter in his hands. That letter contained the sad intelligence of his daughter's death. And Lee subsequently had to inform his sons of their sister's death as well, because it was right about this time Custis came up from Richmond to join the general and help him since he was still trying to recover from his injured wrists. So this was not just a militarily low point for Lee. He's struck by personal tragedy here as well. And this is not the only tragedy that will strike him during the war. In addition to his daughter's death, his only two grandchildren die during the war. The first one, Rooney's, I think it's his son, actually dies during the 7 Days Campaign. Rooney would have another child that dies, I believe, later in 1862 or early 1863. And Lee's daughter-in-law, Rooney's wife, Charlotte, dies just after Christmas of 1863. So Lee is just repeatedly struck with these personal tragedies in addition to everything he's going through militarily. So these are some of the things that you often don't find in a lot of the military histories of the war. There's stuff affecting him that's not on the battlefield. And his wife was a major cause of concern for him as well. I'll talk about that in just a second. I mentioned the death of his grandchildren. This was the second one. She died as an infant in early December of 1862. So just a few weeks after Annie's death, he learns that his second grandchild has died. And he writes a letter of condolence, of course, to Rooney's wife, Charlotte. Now, Lee's relationship with his family throughout the war is interesting. Custis, the oldest son, Lee had a relationship with Custis that he didn't have with any of the other children. He relied heavily on Custis. Since Lee was out in the field most of the time, or at least having to tend to the army, he didn't have the attention to devote to a lot of the family things. So he relied on Custis for this. Even though Custis is an aide to President Davis and has his own life going on here, Lee relied heavily on Custis. When it came to taking care of Mary, Lee's wife, Lee looked to Custis. When it came to making decisions for the younger children, again, Lee looked to Custis. And one of the big ones, when it came time to finish up the great stipulation of his father-in-law's will, the manumission of the Custis and eventually the Lee family slaves, Lee looked to Custis to handle this. And the manumission of the slaves was a huge thing. And that was one of the main reasons why it took Lee 5 years to settle his father-in-law's estate, was because of his father-in-law, the poor record keeping that he had. Lee didn't even know how many slaves the family owned, where they were, who they were. So Lee dumped this in Custis's lap and said, "Here, you handle it." And when it came to dealing with military affairs, Lee was very frank with Custis. He would complain to him when he wouldn't complain to anybody else. There was a famous quote during the Petersburg campaign where Lee complains to Custis, "I've just been up to Richmond and the politicians don't want to do anything but eat peanuts. I can't even get my army fed." So Custis was frequently Lee's his sounding board. When he needed to vent, he turned to Custis. And this is one of those instances right here in early 1863. "Every exertion should be made to getting the army on the strongest footing for vigorous work in the spring. Our salvation will depend on the next 4 months, and yet I cannot even get regular promotions made to fill vacancies, while Congress seems to be laboring to pass laws to get easy places for some favorite or constituent, or to get others out of active service entirely. I shall feel very much obliged to them if they will pass a law relieving me from all duty and legislating someone in my place better able to do it." So again, Custis is the sounding board here for his father quite frequently. And then there's Mary, Lee's wife. She never seemed to understand that her husband was one of the highest ranking generals in the army. It was an active war going on. He had other things, larger things to worry with than her petty problems. Mary was very much a spoiled rich girl, used to getting her way, and she pouted quite often. And you can see in a lot of Lee's writing to her where he's losing patience with her. She never would settle down throughout the entire war. She was constantly leading this nomadic existence, going from place to place after she was forced out of Arlington, and just moving from place to place to place, which caused Lee great stress because he was always concerned that she was in a place of danger. He actually wanted her to come here to Raleigh and live here during the war, but she wanted no part of that. She didn't know anybody here, so she spends time bouncing back between cousins and friends and whoever would take her in up until the last year of the war, when he finally convinces her to settle into what had been his and Custis's house on Franklin Street there, a couple blocks from the state capitol. But she was constantly harping that he didn't write to her enough, or when he did, he didn't, he wasn't telling her things. And she was very careless in a lot of things. She would spend the winters at his request making socks and gloves for the men of the army. This is more a symbolic thing than anything else. I mean, obviously, they're not going to make enough to clothe the entire army of Northern Virginia. They only produced a few hundred. But it was really a symbolic thing, showing, hey, look, the commanding general's wife is making these sacrifices. The rest of the general public needs to do this as well. But one particular instance, I believe it was in summer or fall of '63, she was living with friends in what is now Bedford, out near Lynchburg. And she was drawing army rations from the local quartermaster. Lee at that time was writing letters to Richmond to the Commissary General Lucius Northrop, complaining about how he can't get his army fed. And yet here's his own wife taking army rations. When he found out about that, he went ballistic. And that was one of the few times where he could actually see him lose his temper in writing. So Mary was an added cause of his stress during the war. And her health would fail. And of course, being stubborn, she was supposed to be confined to a wheelchair. She didn't want to do it. And she fell. And I think from the description, it sounds like she broke her hip when she was staying out in Fluvanna County. She was trying to walk on crutches on a tile floor and lost her balance and fell down. And from the description, I'm pretty sure that she broke her hip. But anyway. Before the spring campaign of 1863, Lee suffers what is probably a heart attack. And he's confined to a bedroom here in this mansion, Thomas Yerby's mansion, known as Belvoir, outside of Fredericksburg. And he's there for several weeks. First, he's cared for by Lafayette Guild, the guy on the left there. He was the Surgeon General of the Army of Northern Virginia. Then Guild goes down with an illness. So his assistant, Samuel Bemis, takes over care for the general. And he was not in good health during this time period. But he does not bring any of his staff with him. He only brings, I think it was Meredith with him. Could have been Perry. I don't remember which right off the top of my head. But that's all he brings with him. A&V headquarters remains at A&V headquarters on Mine Road. They would, of course, come and visit him during the day if there was stuff that needed his attention. But doctor's orders, he needed to take it easy. He was not to be concerned with the Army at that point. So here during the first couple of weeks of April, you have to wonder, what if Hooker had actually gone on the offensive here? Longstreet's in Suffolk. Would Jackson have commanded the army, or would Davis have had to send somebody else up to take command of the army during Lee's illness here? And Lee never really recovers from this. He recovers from this bout of it, but he suffers continuing effects from this illness throughout the war, and it's part of what incapacitates him at the North Anna in May of '64. Here's running short on time here, so I'll skip this, but this was just a quote from Bemis talking about his treatment of Lee and how impressed Lee was, or how impressed Bemis was with Lee. After Gettysburg, of course, Lee is on the losing end of that fight. He tenders his resignation. Jefferson Davis does not accept it, but this is an interesting letter of Lee. It's not Lee's normal tone with the president, and I suspect that he wrote this letter different in case Davis actually did accept his resignation. And this letter, I think, was made for publication. It never had to be published, obviously, because his resignation was not accepted. But this letter is very different in tone there. And skip ahead a little bit here to the winter encampment of 1863, 1864 outside of Orange Courthouse. Lee's headquarters would be, I guess you can't see what I'm pointing at. Lee's headquarters was right over here on the shoulder of this mountain. He was sleeping under canvas throughout the entire winter. I did not want to move into a house. He had plenty of offers from local folks to come move into their dwellings, but he would not do it. He preferred to stay out in the open and share the same conditions as his men. But Davis comes to visit the Army of Northern Virginia in late November, and he stays right here in this house, Bloomsbury, which was the home of Francis Jerdone. If you're familiar with Orange, this is just east of town. The old Orange Turnpike is right over here, just out of view. This house is actually right beside Orange International Airport, if you will. The landing strip is just out of frame here. It's one of the oldest houses in Orange County. But during Davis's stay, he takes up residence here at the Jerdone family home. And every morning, Lee comes over to get him, and they will go over the current situation. This was supposed to be a morale building thing. Davis was supposed to make speeches and review Ewell's Corps and Hill's Corps at this point, but it rains the entire time that he's there. So their plans are literally rained out. So it turns into really just an extended conference between Davis and Lee. During the one time that there's a break in the rain, they go up to the top of Clark's Mountain. I don't think they could see much because of the clouds, but Davis wanted to see the Federal Army himself from up there at the observation post on Clark's Mountain. But within a day or so of Davis giving up this idea and returning back to Richmond, Meade goes on the offensive, the Mine Run campaign. So Davis just narrowly missed being at the front during an active campaign. And Custis would, of course, accompanied Davis, and he stayed there with his father during the beginning of the Mine Run campaign. That Christmas is a sad one for Lee. He was in Richmond after Mine Run, meeting with Davis again. Davis was trying to get Lee to go out to take over command from Braxton Bragg out in Tennessee and Georgia. And this was one of the prime examples of Lee and his relationship with Davis. Not only did he talk Davis out of doing this, he convinced Davis to appoint Joe Johnston, who Davis despised. Lee talked him into appointing Johnston to take command of the army instead. But a couple days before Christmas, instead of staying in Richmond with most of his family, Lee goes back to Orange to spend it with Taylor and Marshall and Venable. And he probably wished that he had stayed in Richmond, because Charlotte fell deathly ill on Christmas Day, and she died on the afternoon of December 26th. And he did not have enough time to get back and see her before she died. And at this time, her husband, Rooney, is in a prison camp in up north in, I think he was at Fort Delaware, I think. Might have been New York Harbor. I don't know. Anyway, Rooney was prisoner of war at this time, so he was not able to be with Charlotte in her dying moments either. And Lee was very greatly affected by Charlotte's death. He thought of her as another daughter. He greatly cared for Charlotte. And we'll fast forward to the Overland campaign. Lee is very nearly killed yet again right here at this home called Arlington. It was the Fox family home overlooking the North Anna. Of course, we know about him trying to lead the Texas Brigade at the Wilderness. He tried to lead 2 or 3 more attacks in person at Spotsylvania. This one is not as dramatic. He's sitting on the porch right there, drinking a glass of buttermilk, waiting for some of the other generals to come up to go ride the line there and get a feel for the terrain. Enemy artillery battery arrives on the other side of the North Anna. This house is within range. They see the horses and whatnot gathered out here in front. They throw a couple shells down range. One of them misses Lee by a couple feet, slams into a post on the porch right there and fails to explode. So Lee has a close call with that. And I can't prove this, but I suspect that this buttermilk almost did him in as well. I think that the buttermilk that Mr. Fox gave him while Lee was at his house was probably spoiled because Lee, within a couple hours of this, comes down with a very severe stomach ailment that knocks him flat. And again, I can't prove it, but I think he had food poisoning. If you look at the cause and effect here, it adds up in my mind. And then that is compounded by another illness that just completely knocks Lee out of action for several, almost a period of 2 weeks here at the North Anna, as well as Atlee Station, to the Potomac Creek, and all the way to Cold Harbor. Lee is not himself. He's forced to move inside. He and Venable will famously butt heads here at the North Anna. Venable went in to deliver some message to him, and Lee was just obviously in agony. And Venable, again, the man had no filter, told him, tell Richmond to send Beauregard. You can't command this army like this. Well, that's not what Lee wanted to hear. So the two of them got into it at that point, and really left the army leaderless. A.P. Hill was sick at the time. Ewell was ill at the time. Richard Anderson was just, still cutting his teeth at Corps Command. Jeb Stuart was dead. So there's really a command vacuum here at the highest level of the ANV at the North Anna. And it's, again, I think it's because of this buttermilk. Then we move on ahead well into the Petersburg operations here. In early October, this would be right after, this would be about a week after the capture of Fort Harrison. Lee is trying to organize a counterattack to push the Federals, all of them, back south of the James. And he's meeting with Porter Alexander, Charles Field, Robert Hoke, Richard Anderson, and a couple of others to work out an attack plan for the morning of October 7th. And the long story short, after they all agree on the plan, Lee says, all right, I'm getting up at 2 o'clock tomorrow morning. As I pass your camp, I expect you to be ready to go and fall in with my staff as we move along. So everybody is in agreement. 2 o'clock is going to be the hour. That's the key to this story. Lee is moving at 2 o'clock. Well, the next morning rolls around. Lee's up shortly after midnight. He leaves at 1. He gets to Porter Alexander's headquarters, and he's livid that Alexander is not ready for him. And it had been the same story back at A&V headquarters. Nobody was ready for him. There was no breakfast. Nobody was up except for good old Venable. And Venable's trying to tell him, well, nobody's ready because it's not time. You said 2 o'clock. Look at your watch, old man. It's 1 o'clock. Give us time. We're not ready. This isn't what you said. And Lee was adamant. No, I said 1 o'clock we would move. When they get to Alexander's headquarters, repeat the same story. Alexander's not ready. Venable goes to fetch him and explains to him, I know you're not ready. We weren't ready either. He swears that he said 1 o'clock. And Lee was just in a foul mood that morning and refused to admit that he was wrong. And he was absolutely livid. And he took this out on Venable. Supposedly, he did not speak to Venable for the better part of a week after this episode. And this is perhaps the best example that you have of Lee and his temper, just taking it out on everybody around him at this point. His temper did improve a little bit once the battle got going and things were going initially his way, but not for Venable. He did not forgive Venable for several days afterwards. This is one of my favorite Lee episodes. Lee would have 3 headquarters during the siege of Petersburg: Violet Bank, which was on a hill overlooking the Appomattox River on the north side of the river. Then he moved to this place, the Beasley House, which is in downtown Petersburg. And then from here, he would move out to the Turnbull House, Edge Hill, out towards Fort Gregg. But he's at the Beasley House for not quite a month. It was a great house. Taylor thought he had really lucked out when he found this vacant house and he moved in and took it over his headquarters. But then he found out why there was nobody there. The owners had moved out because they had rented this house to a newlywed couple. They wanted to move into their house. It is their honeymoon after all. They show up and there's all these officers. There's General Lee in their house and they won't leave. So they waited until Lee went to Richmond to meet with Davis later in November. Then they told Taylor, time's up, get out. So they evict Army of Northern Virginia headquarters from their house. And this is both Taylor and Lee leave very amusing accounts of this episode. And when Lee comes back from Richmond, he arrives at the train station. There's a courier waiting for him. Says, "Oh, I'm here to take you to your new headquarters, General." And he's like, "What new headquarters? What do you mean? Why is it new? Why did we move?" And then that's when they explain to him the reason that they had to vacate. But Taylor leaves a fantastic account about choosing their new headquarters at Edge Hill. This is getting almost done here. The only house available was one 2 miles from town. So we came to Edge Hill, and here I am, finally fixed in the parlor with piano, sofas, lounges, pictures, rocking chair, etc. Everything as fine as possible for a winter campaign. After fixing the general and staff, I concluded I would have to occupy one of the miserable little back rooms of the house. But Mr. Turnbull hinted that I should take the parlor, and this decided me. I believe the general was pleased with his room, and on entering mine remarked, "You're finally fixed. Couldn't you find any other room?" "No," I said, "but this will do. I can make myself tolerably comfortable here." Lee was struck dumb with amazement at my impudence and soon vanished. And this was one of those things where, Lee must have had a glint in his eye here as Taylor took the best room in the house for himself and gave Lee one of the smaller back rooms. And Lee would complain to Mary in the first letter that he writes from this house. "The door to my bedroom doesn't even close. All of Turnbull's dogs and cats come in the room because this is the only one they can get into as a fireplace." So that to me is just very amusing about Taylor pulling rank on the general here and giving Lee one of the smaller rooms. Edge Hill does not survive the siege of Petersburg. April 2nd, 1865 is a bad day for Lee for a number of reasons. That's of course the day that Grant breaks through his lines. A.P. Hill is killed just down the road from Edge Hill. He finds out that his daughter Agnes is still in Petersburg. She had come down a few days before to visit her father, but because of everything Sheridan was doing out around Dinwiddie and Five Forks, they were never able to connect up. He thought she'd gone back to Richmond. He finds out while everything is collapsing around him that no, Agnes is still in Petersburg. So he finds an officer, sends him into Petersburg and tells him, "Find my daughter, get her out of here." And he does so. He puts her on the last train out of Petersburg before the train stopped running. And she gets back to Richmond just in time for the evacuation fire. So, pick one, which one's worse. And then after things finally stabilize and he's told Richmond that the time to evacuate Richmond and Petersburg is here, and he's making arrangements for this. Walter Taylor comes to him that evening and says, General, can I go to Richmond? I'd like to get married. And one can only imagine what Lee's reaction was to this initially, but he agreed to it and gave Taylor permission to go up to the Capitol. So he was married to Betty Saunders in the middle of the night and rejoined the Army the next day on the march through Chesterfield County towards Amelia Courthouse. And of course, that was a march that would lead Lee to Appomattox and the surrender there. And from there, he would return back to Richmond and try to figure out what to do with what was left of his life at that point. And I want to leave you with this quote from Freeman. The historian never knows what he's going to find or where. A great file of papers with impressive signatures may yield little. Diaries kept by men who lived at the very pivot point of history may be concerned with things nothing more than eating and sleeping and report of dull doings. Then, perhaps suddenly, when the researcher is digging his way through what seem to be endless strata of dull earth, he may turn up a nugget or treasure that a great man buried or forgotten. I can't tell you how many times I found that to be true as I was doing the research for this book. You know, you're going through just what are some of the most boring letters ever, and then boom, it hits you. You know, there's this great line or this great source of information right there, and it's in one of the most unexpected places that you could think of. So I hope you have enjoyed this tonight. I went a little bit longer than I intended to, but if you do not already have a copy, I would hope that you would be inclined to pick up a copy From Arlington to Appomattox, and I'll be happy to answer a few questions here.
Thank you very much. That was an excellent presentation, very informative. And I know we've had some questions come in. So let me see what we've got in the chat, and we'll see what people are curious about here. So, all right. I do have a question about Lee's last days after April 10th, 1865.
Okay.
So let me see. Oh, I think he goes on. Sorry about this. Let me see. So here we go. Between Appomattox and Chesterfield County are two markers indicating where Lee spent 2 nights on his way to Richmond. What information do we have about the journey other than the admittedly insufficient information on those markers?
Yeah, there's not much. When he leaves Appomattox, he's taken some of the inner circle with him. Taylor's with him. Venable is with him, but not for very long. Venable's family lived in Farmville, so he's not part of the party for very long at all. They stopped the first night, I want to say Buckingham Courthouse area. Then the next night, I think there's an intermediate night. I think there's another night. I can't think of where it was. And then the last night before he gets back to Richmond, he spends at the estate adjacent to his brother's house, right on the James River. There's not really much information about it. I know I didn't find much. There's a couple sources, but not. There's just really not a lot out there. The last night when he's at his brother's house is perhaps the best documented of all. When he left Appomattox, I think it was John Gibbon sent an honor guard to accompany him, but Lee didn't want it. He kept him just long enough to say, "Okay, you've accompanied me. You've fulfilled your orders. Now go away." So it's really just a small party. You know, there wasn't much fanfare to it, so there really were not a lot of people to leave accounts of it. Venable left nothing, but again, he wasn't with them for very long. I don't think Taylor had much to say about it. Rooney joined them. I think the last day Rooney joined them when they were there at Carter Lee's house, but there's really not much at all. So I'm afraid I can't offer much on that one.
Well, that might explain why there's not much on the markers either.
Yeah.
Scott wants to know if any moving portrayal of Robert E. Lee is, if you think it's an accurate portrayal. He mentions Gettysburg And then are any of the other portrayals
I
accurate?
thought I thought Martin Sheen was horrible. I just drew a blank. The guy that played him in Gods and Generals. Why am I drawing a blank? Duvall, Robert Duvall. I thought he was better. He was better than Sheen, but Robert Duvall plays the same character in every movie. Unfortunately, that character is not Robert E. Lee. So no, I don't think anybody has really done a good job. You look back at some of the other stuff like what was it, Blue and Gray, back in the 80s. I don't think anybody has really done a good job, at least in any of the big name, the big production things. I think he would be a difficult person to capture too. And also he's going to be, it's not a role that I would want to try and play, honestly, because of all the scrutiny that you're going to get, both from the historical crowd and also, the ones that still have Lee up on the pedestal, that you're not going to be able to fulfill, I think, what most people want to see as Lee. So it's a role that I would not want.
Thank you for that. And Fernando wants to know, are there references about the relationship that Robert E. Lee had in the pre-war years with Union generals he faced in the battlefield? Are there any accounts in diaries or memoirs by his aides or his staff?
I don't think he would have shared stuff like that with the staff. Sedgwick, he was fond of. He refers to Sedgwick, especially during the Fredericksburg, or excuse me, the Chancellorsville campaign. He always refers to Sedgwick as Major Sedgwick, because that was his rank that he knew him as during the war. And there was also a time, may have been during the Bristow Station campaign, I think, when the Federals had occupied Culpeper, and there was an informant coming out to meet Lee and tell him, which one of the townsfolk had been colluding with the Federals. There was always a huge crowd at Sedgwick's headquarters. Well, Lee was quite taken aback by the accusation that Sedgwick was up to no good. And he said, "Well, Sedgwick is a gentleman. He would only surround himself with the best. So Sedgwick, I think, is probably the one that he was most vocal about. But there's not a lot that I've seen where he talks about the enemy. He did have a cousin who was with Pope. It was one of the marshals. Lee and Marshall were cousins, and there was another marshal who was a staff officer of Pope. That's the one that he mentions the most during 1862, or in summer of 62, when he's writing to his wife, complaining about their cousin who is on Pope's staff.
Interesting. So Christopher asked, what is the best way to remember Lee and acknowledge his accomplishments in this age when some insist there can be nothing redeeming about a slaveholder and a secessionist? How can we tell his whole story?
I think the worst thing anybody can do is look at history or a historical figure through the lens of today. It's not fair to them. It's not fair to you. Times are different. And another big thing to remember, Lee is human. Everybody's human. Everybody has faults. Nobody's perfect. So, I mean, to try and put Lee as this infallible figure is wrong, and so is the other extreme of saying, Lee is the devil incarnate. The truth, as with everything, lies somewhere in the middle. Everybody has good qualities. Everybody has bad qualities. The biggest thing to look at with, I think, when you're looking at especially Virginia officers, as well as the enlisted men themselves, the reasons that the war was fought and that the state seceded are entirely different from the reasons that the men in the ranks are carrying a musket off to war. They're fighting because their country, which back then was their state, asked them to do. The loyalty in the 1860s was to the state, not the United States. It was to your state. In Lee's case, it was to Virginia. In Jackson's case, it was to Virginia. So it's something that you just cannot look at with today's with the lens of today. If you're watching something on the History Channel, I know this is a far out comparison, but if you're watching something about the ancient Mayans or something, and they're talking about human sacrifice, it always comes with the caveat, times were different. The same caveat applies. You cannot look at history through the lens of today, and that is where I think a lot of this falls apart.
Well, thank you. And it's certainly very complicated, and
Absolutely.
individuals are complex.
Yes.
So Larry asked, he says you mentioned early aid George Dees in your book. Did he leave any writing about his time with Lee?
I've never found anything from him. He's a difficult figure to track down. The only correspondence I can find of his is in the official records. I don't know where or even if his personal papers survive. The only mentions I have of Dees are in the official records or in the what do they call it? The Virginia Forces records of the National Archives. I'd
And
love to find them if they exist, but I don't know where they are.
yeah, who knows? Maybe one day.
Yeah.
Karen asked, how did you first become interested in the life of Robert E. Lee? And overall, what kind of relationship did he have with his children? Were they close?
I grew up in Richmond, and my dad grew up on a farm in Mechanicsville. The Outer Defenses actually ran through their farm. The Chickahominy Bluffs, part of the National Park Service thing right there beside Mechanicsville Turnpike, that was part of the family farm back during the war. So going to my dad's parents' house, they always had stuff that they dug up on the fields out there. So like, oh, this is cool. What is this? Like, oh, Civil War stuff. Oh, this is cool. So that had just piqued my interest from as far back as I can remember. And then just going to battlefields and historic sites, going to Washington and Lee, going to Stratford, going to the house in Alexandria, going to Arlington. Lee just, he fascinated me, and his presence in Richmond, definitely added to that. So he's just a figure that's always interested me. So that's the first part of your question, I guess. And the second part about Lee's relationship with his children really varied by which child we're talking about. The oldest daughter, Mary, she was much like her mother. She was an independent spirit, was not going to let anybody tell her what to do. She was, in that aspect, different from the other girls, I think. She was very much a free thinker. None of his daughters ever married. So that was part of a case of, I don't think anybody would have measured up to their father's standards, if he'd been around. So, once Lee died, Custis really became the paternal figure of the family. And I think it was a case of when nobody's worthy to marry any of the general's daughters. Agnes, I don't think, was ever interested in marriage. She had her heart broken during the war. And here again, I just drew a blank on the guy's name that she was engaged to, but he was captured by Union forces and executed as a spy in 1863. And that really did Agnes in emotionally. She did not live long after her father. Custis continued in his father's footsteps. He was president of what became WNL after Lee's death. That was, the college became his career. And then you have Rob. Rob was the inveterate bachelor. Lee, there's an account where Lee went to Romancoke, which was Rob Jr.'s estate near West Point, and he was just taken aback by the way that Rob lived. Just picture a college kid. Picture a college dorm room. That's basically what Lee found, and he did not approve of that. And I think it was either table settings or flatware or something Lee purchased and sent to him because Rob supposedly didn't have any. So, the kids were all individuals. They were all over the place. Rooney was probably closer to Custis than he was to Rob in terms of personality. And then you have Fitz, the nephew, who was out to make as much political gain for himself as he could by having the last name of Lee. But that was definitely something that Lee's children did not have. They were not out to try and take advantage of their last name being Lee.
All right, so we've got, I think, two more questions. How well did Lee know Grant? I recall one time they crossed paths in the Mexican War. This from Scott.
I don't think they knew each other very well at all. Of course, they came to know each other during 1864, but as far as meeting each other, it hadn't really happened. I think they did cross paths just that one time in Mexico, but it was a case of, that they knew each other by reputation before that. I think they only met in person maybe 4 times or something, 3 or 4 times again after Appomattox. So there was respect there, but there definitely, I don't think you could call it a friendship. It was definitely a respectful thing. Grant definitely looked out for Lee after the war, or after Appomattox. In the wake of the Lincoln assassination, there were orders that came down for every former Confederate in Richmond to be arrested. And I think it was Edward Ord was in command in Richmond at that time, and he told Grant rather, look, if I arrest Lee, the war is going to break out all over again. And Grant said, yeah, just let him be. So Grant was definitely looking out for Lee's best interest after the war.
Well, thank you. And one last question. Mike asked, what happened to Lee's manumitted slaves after being freed, after they were freed?
It was that's a complicated question. Some of them remained at Arlington. Some of them had, and here again, this comes back to the troubles with trying to execute that part of his father-in-law's will. And Lee straight up told Custis, I don't know how many there are. I don't know where they are. I don't know how to get in touch with some of them. And even after the manumission papers were filed in the Henrico County courts, Lee said, look, I know we've missed some. I need to name them all by name, and I don't know who they are. So some of them stayed on at Arlington. Some of them, I imagine some of them probably stayed on either at White House and Roman Coke, or if not on the estates themselves, they stayed in the area. I know some of them ran off to join the Union Army. Whether or not they actually round up in one of the USCT regiments, I don't know. That would be an interesting study to see. I don't think anybody has ever explored that, or if they have, I'm not aware of that. But it's a question I really don't have a good answer to, unfortunately. But it would be definitely something interesting to look into.
Yeah, definitely would be. And on that note, this has been a very interesting talk this evening, and it was great having you with us. And for everyone out there, if you're interested, purchase the book. You can get it at the Savas Beatty website. And I believe they're still giving 20% off if you use the code virtual. And then, of course, our museum, I think we have the book as well. So thank you so much. Thank you, everybody, for tuning in tonight, and have a good rest of your evening.
Yes, thank you for being here. Thank you for having me.